So as Roger mentioned, I work for Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, commonly known as ANWR, but we try to call it by its full name because it is actually a national wildlife refuge. And Arctic Refuge was established 50 years ago on December 6th, 1960. And I have a little treat for you guys. Not only will it give you a chance to be outside for a few more minutes after the break, but it'll give you a chance to be some of the first people to see a trailer of our 50th anniversary film.
The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is unique in that it was the first vast area in the United States where entire landscapes would continue to function naturally, free of human influence.
There are so few places in the globe left where the human intent to manipulate, manage, control, subjugate nature for our purposes would be yielded to the natural world.
In the 1950s, a group of visionary conservationists began a long, hard-fought campaign to preserve and pass along one of the finest remnants of our natural heritage.
The Arctic Refuge in particular is one of a kind. The people who had the foresight 50 years ago to set aside that area intact was just a remarkable vision.
Will we have the wisdom to cherish such places, to leave such parts of the earth in their natural state, to visit them humbly and with appreciation?
There are no recreational developments. There are no bridges. There are no signs pointing the way anywhere in the Arctic Refuge.
It really doesn't matter how many times you go out there, you go through that same transformation every single time, and I just need to let it all go and relax and just immerse myself in this place and this experience.
The refuge, still in its natural state, symbolizes freedom, where wildlife takes priority over human activity. It's so important to get close to nature, to give one a new perspective on the natural order of things.
This is a symbolic landscape. Millions who will never visit the refuge find satisfaction, inspiration, even hope in just knowing it is there.
So I get to spend very little of my time actually dealing with recreation management issues. I am the visitor services coordinator for the refuge, but somebody who works for the Forest Service who spoke earlier today mentioned that they kind of do more jack of all trades kind of stuff compared to the Park Service. Well, we make the Forest Service rec people look like specialists because I'm all over the map with my responsibilities and my work. But hopefully, at least by seeing that film, you got a sense that I'm asking you to kind of take a paradigm shift. We work at Arctic Refuge to retain a sense that we don't even exist, that management is kind of under the radar, monitoring things, but letting nature take its course, so to speak. And so that has its set of complications in terms of actually addressing problems. And I think it's kind of funny in a way that Roger asked me to open up the problems section, because many of you are going to look at the issues that we're dealing with and think, oh my gosh, these guys don't have any problems. This woman should just be like rolling around having really nice dreams every night, not thinking about anything. You know, she's got it made. But I look to mentors who've made a difference in my career, people like Roger, people like Joe Van Horn at Denali National Park as well, people like Gary Oy, people like Linda Jalbert, folks who've been around for a really long time and have seen the resources that they love change incrementally, but over time, as they look back on their careers, they think, wow, it's really changed. And I want you guys to imagine a time when you could have both all of the hindsight and all of the wisdom that's in this room, but all of the opportunity to do it right the first time, because we have that chance at your Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So I'm really seeking input from everybody about what would you do if you were me in the context of this situation. So let me get to it. And in addition to celebrating our 50th anniversary over the course of the next year, we're also engaged in a comprehensive planning effort, our first in 22 years. And so it's really a time for us to take a big picture view and assess not only what we're doing, but ponder what we should be doing for the next 30, 50 years. And I know that there aren't many other people here from the Fish and Wildlife Service, if any. Is it true that I am the only U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service person here? I think it might be. Okay, so I have to do duty to my agency and remind everybody that the Fish and Wildlife Service is kind of unique compared to the other DOI land managers in that our mission is to work with partners primarily to conserve fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for present and future generation. We are not about recreation. We are about habitat conservation. So that in and of itself sets up a whole bunch of kind of differences for what I can do and what's a norm within my agency. You'll notice that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in my mind, was conspicuously absent from one of the lists of sponsors, but that doesn't surprise me. So Alaska's national wildlife refuges make up about 80% of the entire U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And we have over 500 refuges and a little under 100 million acres of wildlife and habitat lands within the United States. Arctic Refuge makes up 19 million acres. It is humongous. We are headquartered out of Fairbanks, which is 250 miles south of the southern boundary of Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And our wilderness area is larger than the entire gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. So we have 8 million acres of designated wilderness, and in our comprehensive plan, we're currently undergoing a wilderness review and a wild and scenic river review. So we're considering the potential of recommending Congress additional wilderness and wild and scenic rivers. And even though, based on what I've said so far, you would think that nobody ever comes to the refuge, it does remain largely unaltered, but there's a human story. It's the homeland of the Inupiat Eskimos of the North Slope of Alaska. It is also home to the Gwich'in Athabascans of interior Alaska. More recently, Arctic Refuge has become a premier boating, hunting, and wildlife observation destination within Alaska. And people come from all over the world to experience Arctic Refuge, and they sometimes spend their whole lifetimes waiting to come to the refuge. It becomes somewhat of a mecca or a long journey that they spend their whole lives working towards finally culminating in. There are 3 major laws, though, that affect how public use occurs on national wildlife refuges, and specifically Alaska's refuge as an Arctic refuge. And even before the Wilderness Act was established in 1964, Arctic Refuge was tied to wilderness values. It was the Eisenhower administration that established the Arctic Refuge as a range originally. And now visitors come to the refuge with incredibly high expectations for a very quality wilderness experience in a vast, remote area. We have a couple complications, though. We have no visitor registration whatsoever, no permitting, no designated campsites, no designated access points, no way to have encounters with our visitors prior to their visit. No way to educate our visitors except for through the web. We have an extensive website that we would love people to actually access before they visit the refuge, but whether they do or not, we have no idea. I mean, we take counts of our web hits, and we know that lots of people visit the site, but of the number of people who actually visit the refuge, how many have gone to the website before they visit, we have no idea. Another interesting thing that this focus on wilderness does for us is that even though only 8 million acres of the refuge is wilderness, we really kind of apply a minimum tool attitude towards everything we do. Is it necessary? Should we be doing this? If we're going to retain this environment as a natural laboratory, what's the absolute minimum that we must do administratively to protect the resources that we're responsible for? Another law that really affects recreation in Alaska is ANWR. And some of you have heard of it. Those of you from Alaska know it well. It's truly a profound conservation law. I won't get into the details of it because it's very complex. But it's still being interpreted in the courts. And one of the ways that it really affects public use is that it guarantees access by airplanes, even in wilderness. There are a few exceptions, but that really reinforces the legal requirement for unlimited access points. I think the latest statistic is something like 10% of Alaskan residents are pilots, so private pilots. So you can imagine, a plane is like an RV in Alaska, and we have no idea how many private pilots are even accessing the refuge. It also makes where people originate from or targeting messages very difficult. The third law that really does affect us is the Improvement Act of '97, and that's essentially our Organic Act. It took the National Wildlife Refuge System a long time to kind of figure out what we were about. And even though I said that we're not about recreation, the Improvement Act did clarify that we have 6 wildlife-dependent public uses that we will prioritize. And we will always try to minimize and in some cases disallow activities that are in conflict with the refuge purposes. But if they are wildlife dependent activities, then we try to support them. One of the great things that the Improvement Act did was it gave us direct authority to regulate commercial visitor services through special conditions. And the refuge is so remote that besides the private pilots who are pretty wilderness savvy, most people require at least some sort of commercial support to get to the refuge. They're either doing an independent trip because they're very experienced wilderness expeditionist type people, or they're actually using a guide as well as being flown in. And we can keep track of how many people come, peak visitation dates, and group sizes as best we can through the commercial permit reporting system. And from that, we can track that we have about 1,000 commercially supported visitors each year, and they spend on average 9 days on the refuge. So that's about 9,000 visits that we would count, or user days that we would count annually for Arctic Refuge. I've already mentioned that compared with other federal recreation land managers, we have very little visitor services infrastructure. So we really have to seek partnerships. You can see this woman is a volunteer, and we're trying hard to establish a volunteer base through the Friends of Alaska Refuges. And we also work very closely with our permittees. I'm really happy to report that we overall have a great working relationship with them and have a great problem-solving ethic together. Not to say there aren't differences in opinion, but just to really bring home how little visitor services we have, myself and one law enforcement officer make up the entire public interface for 19 million acres. But permittees are required to avoid conflicts with other users. Sometimes there are cross-cultural misunderstandings because the two villages that are on the northern and southern boundary of the refuge rely heavily on the refuge for subsistence resources and subsistence activities, and the law ANWR that I mentioned to you requires that we add to our purposes the promise to allow and support subsistence activities on refuges. So I work really hard in those neighboring communities to promote an emphasis on shared goals, mutual understanding between permittees, residents, and the refuge. But the issues that the communities are concerned about are usually very different than the issues that the permittees or the visitors or the managers are concerned about. So I really am kind of a go-between for all of these issues and a big ball of yarn. Wait a minute, we're supposed to be talking about human waste, right? Do we have a problem? Why am I here? And more importantly, am I the one that should be solving it? I'm not necessarily convinced that I am, but I want to take your wisdom and bring it back to those folks that I work with, the villagers, the permittees, and use the website that I can as a tool that I can, and then maybe brainstorm other tools I might be able to use. But let's delve into the numbers. So we have over 160 named rivers on the refuge. We have thousands of unnamed tributaries. 5 of our rivers get about 60% of our use. And this graph depicts visitation on the Congacut River, starting in March and going until September. You can see that there are 2 spikes in use. The first is a 2-week concentration during the caribou migration, and people come from all over the world to witness this vast migration of the porcupine caribou herd. And then later there's about a 2.5 or 3-week lesser concentration during the sheep hunting season. And you can see that the Congacut demonstrates the type of use patterns that we have. So not only is our use concentrated on certain river corridors, but it's very concentrated temporally as well. And even within those temporal concentrations, for example, the sheep hunting season, there aren't sheep all along the river corridor. The sheep are in the higher mountainous areas. So you've got, relatively speaking, very high numbers of people in very small areas in very concentrated periods of time. The Congacut River is our most visited river. It receives approximately 21% of our visitation, and that means about 240 visits per year. Visitors. So that means you'd have to multiply 240 by 9, because that's the average trip length, to get how many poops are going onto that river corridor per year. And then when you think about the fact that we have very rocky cobble, you can see this tundra bench here. If you were to be walking on that tundra bench, you might find as little as 1.5 to 3 inches of soil cover over rocky cobble. We definitely can imagine that in an Arctic environment, poop is not going anywhere anytime soon. Poops are accumulating on the Arctic refuge. So some guides are shifting use from away from the Congacut and some of these more popularly visited rivers because they're, quite frankly, disappointed in the way we've been not limiting the use numbers, and they feel that they're not being able to offer their clients the quality wilderness experience that they are expecting when they pay those high amounts of money to come to the refuge. Some people are thinking that we should be making limits right now. Some people are focused on the fact that it's all about the poop. And whether they're for it or against it, maybe that is the fulcrum issue. You can see that some of our air operators are in opposition to transporting the waste, which you've heard before. But really what it comes down to is that our barriers, our issues, are social probably more than they are physical. Although there may actually be some physical concerns in very specific points along the Congacut River and other areas. We have pretty extreme education barriers or complications to how we can educate visitors. And we have lots of complex social conflicts that deal with cross-cultural communication among people from different heritage, different histories. So can we retain these low use or these low regulations? Can we retain this really hands-off, unique, freedom-focused opportunity for visitors that they can find nowhere else in the United States? If we decide that we have to regulate, what should we regulate first? What's the most important thing to regulate? Is it overall numbers, or is it how people are going to haul out their poop? What are the best practices for the Arctic? There's so little research, and thank you so much for those of you that are doing the hardcore research that helps us make the best decisions as managers. But should we be recommending cat holes? Should we be recommending carry out? From a leave no trace perspective, what truly is the best for the Arctic environment? We have such dispersed use that we can't provide any facilities or disposal structures within the refuge, and the gateway communities are very opposed to affluent tourists using their villages as a dumping ground for their you-know-what. Talk about a metaphor for some of the societal issues related to Native relations in the government over time. I mean, so partnerships form around passions, and a lot of people are really passionate about Arctic Refuge. But like Doug and Wade were saying, you know, these are like really high order values. Like, I love the refuge. I want to save the refuge. I want to preserve the refuge. What does that look like in terms of visitation regulations? What do you actually tell people to do?